Solasta, Crown of the Magister, is a stereotypical Dungeons & Dragons CRPG that is often predictable and quite cheesy in its delivery, and for those reasons, I absolutely loved it. The game succeeds because it feels exactly like sitting round a table with your mates playing the tabletop D&D role-playing game, even right down to the terrible accents that your DM will put on for the NPC characters. Seriously, I enjoyed Crown of the Magister far more than I expected to, although the game is not without its faults, which we will come on to later. But if you'd like to see my entire playthrough of it, then do check out the link in the description. And just for transparency, the developers did send me this copy of Solasta for free so that I could review it, but it's also included with Game Pass for PC, so you can play it there, and you can buy it from Steam or my preferred platform, GOG.com, and there's a link down in the description below where you can buy it. The story is set in the fantasy realm of Solasta, a fairly typical D&D world, including the usual races of humans, elves, dwarfs, halflings, half-elves, orcs and goblins, plus a wide variety of monsters to go out and bash. And unlike many games of the genre that don't live up to their namesake title, this one does actually include dungeons and dragons. There is also another pesky race of lizard-like shape-shifting creatures called the Sorax. These guys are bad news because they're trying to end the world by summoning their dark god. And they're going to do this through the fabled and missing Crown of the Magister. And that's where you come in. Unlike a lot of RPGs, you don't just create one character then pick up 3 NPCs to tag along. You get to create all 4 in-depth background, classes, everything. More on this later. And then your 4 characters are going to be hired by the local powers that be to investigate the Sorax, investigate strange goings-on, look into the Crown of the Magister, and of course save the world, but you know, that goes without saying. As well as the main story, there's a ton of side quests to do, including an appearance from a very popular and successful streamer playing one of the characters in the game. See if you can spot them when you play through. As to the game mechanics, it feels like a cross between the old Baldur's Gate games and the newer Divinity Original Sin series, where you point and click around the screen to move your characters around the location that they're in, to go and explore and talk to people. But when it comes to a fight, it kicks down into turn-based tactical combat, where the player characters and monsters will all get to take a turn in initiative order. The rule system in use in this game is D&D 5th edition rules, and from what I can tell, it sticks to them pretty damn closely. From what I've played on the tabletop version of D&D 5th edition, it all feels a very accurate rendition here, with just a few changes to make it work on a computer. Combat is a fairly simple affair, with each character getting 2 basic actions, one being an attack action, one being a move, although the different classes can change this up a little bit, and different feats and abilities will allow you to do different things with your actions. You also get a bonus action, which is different per class as well. But do be aware that it's not full D&D class rules, there's no multi-classing, and they're not quite all included, yet at least. I should also note that it's not an open world game. Each zone in the world, whether it be a city or a town or an old ruin, dungeon, is instanced, and you'll travel between them on the world travel map, where you can set your party off doing other activities like crafting or gathering materials. But you will need to carry food for the journey, so make sure you got enough. As I say, it sticks to rules around food and travel and encumbrance pretty tightly. Now, before I talk about the graphics and sound, I really do feel I should point out that this isn't a AAA game. There is a limited budget here, and it shows in some of the audio and some of the visuals. But graphically, whilst walking around the game world and fighting the monsters looks acceptable, and some of the later levels do look absolutely amazing. I won't give you any spoilers, but there are some of the last 2 levels of the game I thought looked fantastic. The game falls down mostly in the cutscenes and the story scenes. Here, it's the animation of the characters that really doesn't look right. And it's even worse if you've made a player character with a beard. My human male paladin, I added a beard and mustache on, and unfortunately, whilst the facial movements are animated when he's talking and saying his lines, they didn't animate the facial hair to match. So the head moves around, the lips move, the nose and the eyes move, but the beard stays in place, and it looks ridiculous. Also, all the characters are stood in very strange poses throughout most of the cutscenes. And this is a similar issue with the audio as well. Whilst the soundtrack is very good and fits the theme very well, I like that, the voice acting leaves a bit to be desired. The main characters are voiced adequately well, but some of the NPCs are absolutely awful.
Another round, barkeeper. 4 of your finest flagons of donkey piss, please.
You came. I wondered, considering your new rank.
How are you, Master?
It's nice that you pretend to care.
Just poor choices in both the voice actor and in the recording as well. We'll talk a bit more about this later. Fortunately, Crown of the Magister does not rely on amazing graphics and fancy sound effects to be a good game though. So let's talk about my likes and dislikes, and as always, starting with the good stuff, it is pretty true to D&D 5th edition rules. Now this is a good thing if you like D&D 5th edition rules. If you've played the tabletop version of Dungeons and Dragons, don't like the current rule set, maybe not so much for you. But D&D 5th edition I have found is more accessible to new players who've never done a Dungeons and Dragons campaign before. This allows them to get into the game a bit easier. It's a bit more forgiving. It's not as harsh on lower level characters. So I think that's a good thing, and they've stuck to the rule set very accurately from what I can see, barring 1 or 2 omissions and a few changes they've made to make it work on a computer. But it's there, it's accurate, all the class progressions, and incredibly so, the character creation. Now I mentioned you create 4 whole characters in this. You go through the whole creation process. You pick the race, the class, the subdomain if you're playing a cleric with gods and different options there. You also pick the backgrounds, and the backgrounds not only dictate some of the starting skills and where you can go, but they also affect a little bit of in-game story and some side quests you can do with each character as well. It's nothing major, but it's there, and it really does feel like you're building a character from the bottom up, just like in D&D. I should also mention at this point, if I haven't already, that not all classes from the D&D rule set are available in the game. At the moment, I played with a paladin, a rogue, a cleric, and a wizard. They're adding sorcerer into the game through a free DLC. There's also ranger available as well, and I might have missed one out, but there's no druid or bard or monk at the moment, and you can't multi-class. You pick a class and you stick to that class. If that's a problem for some of you, then that's going to be a shame. But unless things change down the road with patches and DLC and inclusions, after this review, do go and check if you're thinking of buying in the future and see if they've included any of these extra characters. But at the moment, that's the state of play. I, however, had quite a bit of fun with the classes that were there. And progression for these classes is, just as it is in 5th edition rules, very good. They start off kind of feeble in most cases and vulnerable, but they soon become excellent at what they specialize in. For example, my paladin ended up being an absolute killing machine with a 2-handed axe, my main damage dealer, and my elven mage, a few levels up into the game, started becoming lethal, flinging fireballs around at the start of battle. And if you really don't like the randomness of character creation when you're rolling dice for stats, you can manually spend the number of points and customize it, or you can just re-roll the dice until you get a result that you want. You don't have to, but the options are there. In fact, there's loads of options for how tightly the rules are applied in the game settings. That's another plus and worth checking out. But the combat is the mainstay of the game. It's turn-based tactical combat. Your characters go in initiative order. Sometimes that's after the enemies. You can surprise the enemies through stealth, or the enemies can surprise you if you just walk straight into an ambush. It can go both ways. Sometimes you get a good opportunity to set up a fantastic ambush yourself, which opens with a fireball, which takes half of them out in the first round. One of my favourite tactics. And other times you just blunder into a load of them, and before you're ready, because you didn't see what was coming or you weren't being cautious enough, and it can get a little bit hairy in the first few rounds. But the combat is pretty good. It's something I liked. I do like turn-based games rather than real-time and pause. I prefer it like this. I like to be able to think of my tactics and strategies. You can see who's going to go next due to the turn order at the top of the screen, and that's something I enjoy. So naturally, I enjoyed it here. The story of the game is also something I quite liked. I'm not going to give you any spoilers, but it kind of progressed at a nice pace. There was lots of different little plot lines that seemed to be going on in the middle, and it was one of those situations where you actually stop and think, oh, is that person an infiltrator, a traitor? Is that person over there on my side? Are they telling the truth? And the story was actually so good that I wasn't sure how it was going to end and who were going to turn out to be the bad guys at the end. I had lots of little theories going on about which plot was going to lead to someone being outed as the bad guy, and I was actually quite wrong with most of it, which is always a good thing, but I wanted to see the story through to the end. It flowed quite nicely, although I maybe should say I felt like it went a little bit too fast at the end. Overall, the story was pretty good, and as I said, it felt like it was being delivered by your friend sat across the table reading from his Games Master's handbook. And the other thing that I really liked about the game was the crafting. Now, you craft by finding recipes littered throughout the world, and some that you can buy from various factions that you have to gain a bit of rep with in the city. But you get these recipes, and then they're for potions and scrolls and magic weapons and armor, and it's the weapons and armor ones that I really liked. Oh, and poisons as well, I should have mentioned that too. But the weapons and armor stuff, unlike a lot of games where you can craft things and you get something fairly mundane, some of the crafted gear in this is absolutely superb. I was expecting, oh, go on, it'll be something boring like a +1 longsword, and yes, there is some of that in, but the better crafted weapons and gear are amazingly good, and that's not often the case. And unfortunately, as there are in all games, there are a few things that I didn't enjoy so much about Solasta Crown of the Magister, and the most obvious is probably going to be the cutscenes and the voiceover. Now, I can live with janky looking cutscenes, that doesn't bother me too much, but poor voice acting, or poor audio recording, or editing, or whatever it is that's caused the issue here, is something that really jars with me.
I heard you went to Kerlem in the Marches.
That's right.
There is an old Termarian tower there.
Some of the NPCs you meet in here are going to be so badly voiced and acted, you're going to be questioning what the game developers were thinking of. It sounds like they've used amateur voice actors and people who are forcing accents that they're clearly not trained or practiced in to do.
What about the Baron?
I've known him for 20 years. I was a founding member of the company. Now, for the first time in 10 years, I am Officer of the Day posted here, and that's not all. For the last 10 years, he's always called me Joris. Now, all of a sudden, it's back to Nikkonen.
And I jokingly said earlier, it does sound like it's your mate playing as DM putting on or trying to put on a bad accent to play one of the characters in the dialogue. And if you look at it like that, it can be funny. But some of these voices are so annoying, you're going to want to skip through them and turn them off and not listen to what they have to say. More noticeable in a side quest than anything in the main story, I will add. But it could have been done better. It's something that really, really grated on me. Now, I mentioned earlier that some of the classes were missing from the game. It's going to really suck if your favourite D&D class isn't included in this game, but that might change as patches and DLC or maybe expansions are introduced down the road. So if you're watching this review a year or two after I've made it, then do check the game information and see if they've added more in. I know Sorcerer is coming in a DLC, for example. Also, multiclassing, no multiclassing. Now, the fact that there's limited classes and no multiclassing, I feel it does affect the party makeup balance a little bit, because I played through with a strong melee fighter, a rogue, a wizard, and a cleric. The wizard and cleric I felt were essential to get through the game. The healing and the magic, absolutely essential. One melee fighter of whichever class you want is probably a really good idea, though. If you want to play hardcore, you might be able to manage without. But the rogue, there were so many traps to disarm and so many chests to unlock. I feel it would have been difficult to do without the rogue, so you switch that one out for something else, but then you're missing out on huge parts of the game, and there's some amazing magic items in chests which make the game a lot better. So, do you take a rogue? Do you miss out on that? Do you rely on trying to get the wizard spell, Knock? I think it's a wizard spell anyway, which unlocks some chests, or do you just lose out? I don't know. So, you always have this issue with D&D that you can't get every class and skill into the party that you would want, but because there's no multi-classing available here, I feel like it's made a little bit worse in this situation. So the next thing that was a personal ball ache for me was the encumbrance system. Now, this is not a fault of the games and developers. This is brought over from D&D, and I do know that a lot of games masters and dungeon masters don't rigidly enforce the encumbrance system. They don't have you counting the weight of every battle axe and bag of rations that your characters carry, because that's not fun when playing through an adventure in a tabletop with your mates when you only meet once a week or so. And guess what? It's not fun here either. It doesn't take much before you become encumbered and then get penalties to movement, to stealth, to combat and things like that. And that's where it becomes a real pain, because if you pick the loot up and you want to pick the loot up so you can sell it, then you rapidly become encumbered, and then you have to start dropping things and leaving things and shuffling things about. And the food that you have to carry to go on the long marches from zone to zone on the world map, that weighs an absolute ton. And you never want to leave too much weight on like a melee fighter, because it's going to slow them down. They can't move as far to get into combat. But you don't want to put it on the rogue either. If they're encumbered, they get big penalties. Now, they've added a system in. There's a faction called the Scavengers. Any crap that you leave on the floor in, say, an old ruins that you visited, or just an ambush location as you're traveling, they will actually go and collect it for you and bring it back. You can then sell it, and you think, well, what am I complaining about? If they've got the system in where the loot's collected, they bring back, you can sell it, what's the problem? Well, if you can do that, then I'm asking, why bother putting an encumbrance system in anyway? Because it just slows you down and adds unnecessary inventory management as you're moving around. If you're going to get the crap to sell anyway, albeit, you know, a few game days later or a week later in game than you actually completed that section, then why bother with it? I don't know, but encumbrance in games is something that is a personal peeve of mine, because I don't think it adds any fun to the experience. I will say also, one thing that kind of detracted from the game a little bit was I felt that the ending was a little bit rushed. Certainly the story and the cutscene at the end, it finished too fast, leaving things unanswered. And I had lots of questions and stuff, but also I got sucked into the end quest too quickly. And this might have been the case here, but perhaps I missed it. But normally in games, you have a thing that says, you are about to embark on a journey that you can't come back from. Have you finished everything else you want to do? And I didn't see any warning like that. That's not to say it didn't happen, because I was streaming and might have been distracted, but there was nothing obvious and nothing I had to click on to say yes. And therefore, I had 3 or 4 side quests which I was really keen to go and do on the boil, and I didn't get to do them because I got sucked into the end quest, which is actually a series of quests, and at each point it says, no, you can't leave to go and do that. No, you can't, you have to go here. No, you can't go and do that now. And I missed out on some stuff. And the last thing I'm going to mention in this list, it's not a problem for me, but it might be for you, is D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. Do you like the rules? Do you like the spell system, the magic system, where you have so many spell slots and you have to then camp and rest to get those slots back? I didn't find that an issue in this game like I had in others like Baldur's Gate 3, the early access version. This seemed to work quite well, and it wasn't too bad. But if you don't like D&D rules, you won't like this game, because it adheres strictly to D&D rules. Just thought I'd mention that here. So in conclusion, despite some wonky cutscene animations and some very shady voice acting, I really enjoyed Solasta Crown of the Magister. I do recommend it, and I do believe it is worth playing, and I would rate it a good solid 8 out of 10. Yes, it could be improved, and maybe some patches and DLC will improve that, but overall, I really enjoyed the game, far more than I expected. Maybe some slight issues with replayability, the story's always going to be the same, but there are things that I missed in the game, some side quests, and it'd be kind of cool to play it through with a completely different makeup of party characters with some different classes in there. Don't forget to check the links in the description so you can find more information on the game or watch my full playthrough.